Hi everyone and welcome to Training for Life Redeemed. I'm Dan and I'm here with my father David Jackson. We are going through the theology of the child.
Yep.
We're kind of now looking more at the processes of raising children and giving them informed choices. That's the right phrase. I'm trying to remember what the phrase was. And so how do we go about doing that? We talked a bit about that last week, and this week, Dad, we're going to be diving into how are we going about reading the Bible with our kids?
Yeah.
Where do we start? What kind of plan do we have in terms of going forward? What do we want them to achieve? And then how do we best kind of guide that and nurture that process, I guess? So let's jump straight back to a little bit from last week. We talked a bit about using catechisms, and we talked about basically making sure our kids read the entirety of the Bible. We talked about that last week. So how do we do that? Do I just kind of go, well, I've got a Bible reading chart, let's mark off the chapters and eventually we'll get the chapters done? Do I start at the beginning and just read from Genesis until I get to Revelation? Does it make a difference if I do it that way? Should I be doing it chronologically and take Isaiah and stick it in when I get to him in Kings, and Jeremiah's at the end of this and before we get to that? And what are we doing as we try and get our kids to know the text?
When we start off with little kids who can't read, if you start off with preschoolers, where everything has to be simplified down to a level where their language will cope with it. So we usually start with Bible picture books, with mum and dad talking about the text, or Sunday school teachers or whoever's doing this. We have, from that level, we go to Bible story books, where we're retelling the Bible, and that's always dangerous. So to retell the Bible doesn't mean we reinvent it to get that story right. But when you simplify, you lose something. So you must have a plan in your mind as to how you're going to start with simple things, put a foundation and a structure, and then build on that until we fill it in with the whole of what the text says. And by the time you're an adult, that is a growing understanding. So simplifying isn't wrong, it's a necessity, but in the process we've got to be really, really careful, because when you put the foundation down in the frame, that determines where everything else is going to go. So here we are, we need to be planning what we call a scope and sequence. Can you explain scope and sequence?
You're just basically laying out what order you're going to be doing things in, really, and you do it for a whole year at least for scope and sequence. But like, I know I laid out one for our church that was the first 7 years of school, to go from kindergarten to year 6 of what we're going to be teaching and addressing when, and there's a thoughtful process that goes into that to make sure that you're getting a mix maybe of I want to be working my way through the Old Testament and through the New Testament, but if I spend the entire time in the Old Testament, it might take a while before kids get to a New Testament, a long while really, and you do want to be talking about Jesus earlier on. So that's why I've done a mixed approach where they've done Genesis, then they did Mark, they did some bits of Mark. I think we may have actually done, because I was looking at, I think we did this more story stuff, so we did Jesus' miracles first, I think.
Yeah.
And then we went back to Old Testament, we came forward and we did Jesus' parables maybe, and then back and forth, and now, we're currently doing Jesus' death and resurrection and his appearances to his disciples and the importance of that for the kids. And this is now, this is our third year that we're halfway through, when they're getting to that point. And it's not that they haven't heard Jesus' death and resurrection yet, because we did it in the miracles. Yeah. Right? But we are, they're getting multiple points on the gospel, but also getting that foundation stuff.
So you've got a sequence of what you're going to do in which order. And we put together usually a term or so of Old Testament, and then we go to New Testament, and then we come back again, and we're doing left foot, right foot. That's our sequence. What about our scope?
Well, your scope is what you're actually covering. And so for us, I seek to cover the full scope in terms of the Bible, covering all the books.
So,
And then-
for example, you were talking about in Mark's Gospel, you're going to do narrative, you're going to do miracles, you're going to do what else?
Yeah, so there's teachings. So I broke it up into the miracles. I think is one of the first things we looked at, and then we went from that into Jesus' parables, because there's because most of the parables are narrative based.
Yeah.
It's easier for the kids to learn. Like you're picking the passages that are suitable for this children's age. So I'm not going to do, like we're doing this stuff that I'm currently doing with the kids at my church. We're looking at, Jesus enters into Jerusalem, and it's his, we do the Lord's Supper, and we do his arrest and stuff at Gethsemane. I did not do everything that John has that Jesus is teaching at the Last Supper.
Okay, so
we didn't do the complex nature of the Holy Spirit and what's happening on multiple levels there. We just did.
So we're looking at the sequence of the narrative events, the chronology.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we would say to parents and to people planning these things, often Bible programs for children have the chronology all over the place. So when I did my dip ed, I had to do a thing on moral and religious education. I thought, there's a window of opportunity. The lady who lectured the course was a Christian, and so I did a survey of our Sunday school kids with the permission of the superintendent. We had about 200 kids in Sunday school back in the day. So I surveyed them to see if they knew the difference between when things happened, which came first, Noah, Moses, David, Jesus. Can you put them in order? Not a chance in the world. It was all random. Mind you, it was also random. They didn't know whether which story was in the Bible and which wasn't. So David and Goliath, Jack and the Beanstalk. You look at that and you go, something's wrong with our scope and sequence, because we don't know the order of events. We can't fit them into the sequence of God's work of salvation. That makes a big difference to comprehending what's going on. The other thing we did was to note that there's narrative story. You've got abstract things that are happening, as you described. Mm-hmm. When you get into parables, you're doing a little bit more abstract stuff. When you get into John's Gospel, it's getting a lot more abstract.
Yes, yeah. And I wouldn't plan on doing a lot of John's Gospel until year 6, really.
Yeah.
For the kids I'm teaching. But having said that, the Sermon on the Mount, you can do a lot earlier.
You can do a lot earlier.
It's a lot more simple.
Simple enough, yeah. And you can build on that. So keeping the chronology in order helps, and then our scope is when we break that down and say, I'm going to do this part of Matthew or this part of Mark, and then when I come back on the next cycle, which might be in 3 years or 4 years' time, we'll do the stuff that so we would teach the Exodus narrative, skip over building the tabernacle, skip over Leviticus, skip over in Numbers, pick out the narrative out of Numbers. And then the next cycle we'll come back and we'll look at Torah, at the Ten Commandments, we'll look at what the tabernacle was all about. We'll go and have a look at Deuteronomy. So you do the abstract after you've done the narrative. That's all cool. But for little kids, you're also scoping that through in terms of how you represent that to the children. Are you summarising it? Are you retelling it? Or when you get to grade 3, they can read it for themselves. One of the things that I think we need to stress is that when a child can read, or even before that, it's really important that we give up retelling the Bible and we go straight to reading the text. One of the problems I note listening to so many of these is that whenever you retell the Bible, you actually damage it. Because you read into it things that aren't there, you take out really significant things that need to go in. We're redoing it, and when we redo it, we don't do it well all
Yeah.
the time.
I mean, automatically, if you're not just reading the text, you're interpreting it.
Yes.
And that then requires, and you were talking a bit later about the need for us as parents to actually have a very good understanding ourselves to be able to do any kind of
We need
guidance here with our
You
students.
need to know the Bible really, really well. Because that James 3 passage, let not many of you become teachers, will be judged with greater judgment. When you're laying a foundation with a child, there should be an element of the fear of God in us. Jesus talks about if you cause one of these fellows to be trapped in some wrong understanding or something, it'd be better to put a rope around your neck and tie it to a millstone. And I got a bit of a surprise. I always thought it was like a mortar and a pestle. The millstone is a stone big enough that a donkey
has
needs
to turn it.
Yeah, he's really serious about how we lay foundations with children here. So that becomes an issue, which then brings us to the selection of the materials that we might use to support all of this. Because kids, the younger the child, the more visual. We've almost lost the art, by the way, of telling stories. That is a bit of a worry. One of my loves as a child, one of the things children really do love is to hear stories, and to hear them orally, and to hear them in person. I used to love going across the fence to my next door neighbour, Robbie, and Robbie was a girl who married an Australian serviceman in World War One. And she came back to Australia, and she had the best stories about her growing up in England back in the turn of the century, and I mean the 19th to 20th century. For a little boy, they were great stories. No pictures, no nothing. Just listen to Robbie telling her yarns, and my Uncle Garner telling his yarns. Well, there's a place for that with kids. But once you introduce the visual into that, whether it be picture books, or now we have animation, we have channels on the internet.
Yeah.
We've got so many resources to do this, and some of them replace mum and dad or replace the teacher, and so you're putting the kid on automatic pilot. That's not a good thing to do. It should be a supportive thing, not a replacement. We don't need the one-eyed Bible teacher any more than the one-eyed babysitter. So that brings us to some of the issues that we've got when we visually present the Bible. Which ones come to your mind?
Well, I mean,
or which picture Bibles would you recommend?
Oh, which ones do I recommend? When I recommend them, I don't normally focus so much on the images, to be honest.
Yeah.
I'm normally focusing more on whether or not the text bits in them line up well with the text itself.
So what are you looking for?
Having said that, I still don't, like, whenever I'm looking for images and stuff to use with the kids at school, whether it be colouring in or whatever, for Sunday school, etc., I do purposely try and make sure I'm not looking for a white Jesus. I'm not looking for a blonde hair, blue-eyed person. Like, I'm looking for someone that is vaguely, I guess I don't be perfect. Like, I guess we're not going to get it perfect, but he was an Israelite, so he should look like an Israelite. He's, and so should all of his followers. And the people who are not Israelites should look like Romans or Greeks or, you know.
One of the things, I did a book review some time ago for an academic who had gone through picture Bibles that evangelicals use with their children. And I was horrified. I mean, this woman hates the Bible and she hates evangelicals, and she was doing a review of what we teach our children. And really, sometimes you've got to go to your enemy to see what you're doing and see how it's perceived. But she noted things like, in the Bible, all the good guys look like Europeans, and all the bad guys have coloured skin.
Yep.
So when you go and have a look at the Bible, these picture Bibles, you go, this is about as racist as it gets. It's not historically accurate, and it imprints our culture over, it maps our culture over the Bible for the children.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful. There were other things in there that were equally scary. One of the things that bothered me was when you look at artwork illustrating the Bible, why is it that Israelites look like Bedouin Arabs? The women are all wearing a hijab.
Yeah.
And you go, is that historically accurate? And the short answer is probably not. So I go back, and we've travelled around a little bit, and you look at the tomb paintings of Israelites coming into Egypt and what they're wearing, and then you look at how that story, at the time of Joseph, how that story is told in a Bible storybook. Over here, you've got people that are, there's Israelites and there's Egyptians, and they're dressed totally differently. Over here, they get the Egyptians right, but the Israelites all look like wandering Arabs. They look like they literally walked in out of Saudi Arabia or something. It's culturally inappropriate. We have, one of my favourites is go through children's Bible stories and look for pictures of Samson.
Mm-hmm.
So Samson is an ordinary man whose power comes from the Holy Spirit. But when you draw him in a child's picture Bible, he looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger, which means that the power is coming from his muscle, not from the Holy Spirit. We've reinterpreted the text, and we've missed the point of the text in the process, and we've embedded that image on a child. The other one that amuses me are pictures of Sarah when she's having a baby. So Sarah is 90-something years old, and she's about to have Isaac.
Yep.
And at that time, she was so stunningly beautiful, Pharaoh would kill to have her. And Abraham lived in fear of his life, going around with this beautiful woman. So Bible storybooks depict her looking like she's
old and frail,
belongs in a nursing home. And you go, he lived to be 175. These people age at half our age, half the rate we do. She should be pictured as a 45 to 50-year-old woman at menopause age, only she's the stunning Vogue cover girl model. Our storybooks are making a bit of a mess of what the text is actually telling us, and we need to get that right to present it. The architecture. I've got some pictures here. I was in Cambridge. I picked up some pages from an old 18th, 17th century Bible storybook, and they're engravings. And all of the scenes of the Old Testament and so on look like they came out of Renaissance Italy. You know, we map the Bible, we domesticate it. And our children need to know its history, and it's different.
Yep.
And it actually happened. There are other issues in there too.
All right. So which resources do you recommend then, Dad?
Well, we had the Bible. Well, the first thing to look at, as you say, is the text of these Bible storybooks. Do they tell the story as a Christian narrative that leads us to Christ and the gospel? Or are they, my categories are Mother Goose, cute bedtime story, Aesop's fables, you know, good boys go to heaven, bad girls go to Amsterdam. Is it about your morality, or is it about Jesus? So there are some, the Jesus Storybook Bible, for example, the Big Picture, what's it called?
Big Picture Story Bible.
The Big Picture Story Bible, those sorts of things. Look for the theology of the book before you look at anything else. Is the Old Testament pointing us to Christ, or is it just a story?
Yeah. And the thing I like most about the Jesus Storybook Bible is that every single story, it has a little section at the end about how this story then points to Jesus.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it can be as simple as the promises to David, and then it goes, you know, and eventually there's going to be a great, better king that comes, and that's going to be, like, they don't explicitly say it's Jesus the whole way through until you get to Jesus, and then they're like, here's the one that fulfills all the promises. And
But so when you're putting the pieces of the jigsaw down, you're forming a picture that's coherent, and it's the gospel. It's not random pieces of mythology almost.
Yeah.
So that's important. The other thing that came up today, while I was looking at all of this, is your mother was playing some Colin Buchanan.
Yeah.
and I'll hold that up. Colin Buchanan, what's it called? Remember the Lord. And my ears pricked up because some of the songs on that CD are taken from our catechism, Q's and A's for Kids. And some of the songs were songs written by a lady in our church when you were a little fella, Julie Thompson. And they're beautiful songs, but they're Bible verses set to music. And it's about memorising the text. And that made me think back. I went to a nursing home, the Baptist nursing home down near Macquarie Uni, to visit an old godly lady. She was 94. She had Alzheimer's. And a friend of mine, we went to visit her. And I was waiting. You go in, only one person could go in. She was well advanced in Alzheimer's. And this male nurse was standing there, and he was saying, "What do you reckon these old dears, what's the last thing they remember? When they've forgotten your name and their name and who their kids are, what's the last thing they remember?" And we were sort of looking at him a bit puzzled, and he said, "The songs they learned in Sunday school." If you go into the nursing homes and the mind is confused in all of these other things, you sing the first line of those Sunday school choruses and they'll all join in. He said it's staggering to see. So there's great power in what we teach the little ones will stay with them the longest, and the music that they sing. So you were showing me some...
some videos from Seeds Family Worship, and really any music that's the scripture to music. Seeds Family Worship just add hand motions, which also helps with memorization.
The actions.
And then like we're using that at the moment at our church. Some of the Seeds Family Worship songs, and I picked them out as the memory verses that we're doing that match up with the topics that we're looking at.
Yeah.
And I then just have the kids doing it, every week. And this week, we've got a couple of weeks left of this term. All right, guys, there's no music. Tell me what the memory verse is. And even the boys who are at our church who hate the song, who don't stand there doing any of the actions.
Boys don't do that.
I just tell them that I tell them, I don't care if you do the actions or not, but you have to be paying attention to it. They still, both boys, could recite the whole thing.
Yeah.
They didn't do actions, they didn't sing it, but they recited the verse.
Yeah.
And that's without them even doing any of the extra bits,
Yeah.
And it works. It does work very well.
It's like an earworm. One of the things that, it annoys me, but I'm respectful of the power of it, is that this generation of people growing up sing with an American accent. All the music they listen to has this American accent, so they love and guard and all this sort of stuff. My age, I find that annoying. But it speaks loudly to the power of the music to get the concepts to get the words and the power and the whole feeling of the thing into the memory, and then to make it part of the culture. We need to be doing that and choosing wisely what we pair with our Bible reading.
Now, as we keep going, Dad, with the age of our kids, by the time they're in year 3, you want them to be reading...
Year 3.
Year 3, yep. Not by the time they're 3. Year 3.
Year 3.
So that's around 9.
Yep.
You say that they should start to read the Bible themselves.
Yes.
Which Bibles would you recommend? Because I don't want to give them a King James necessarily. They're going to struggle with that. It's not even, particularly if it's the old thys and these. Yep. Most of the Year 12 students still can't handle that. But what do I do with the little kids? Like when they're reading?
So when I was in grade 3, my mother bought me a King James Bible, and I read that thing, and I struggled with it, but I read it because it was interesting. It was exotic. There's all sorts of stuff in there, including rude words.
Yeah.
So we got into all of that, and then I found a Bible that had a summary of each chapter. The old King James, some of the editions had a little summary of what was in the chapter. And so I went through and I read the summaries, and I go, now I get the flow of the story. And then I could go back and read. Then later they came out with the RSV, and I thought, I got one. Mum gave me one of those, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is great. This flows much more easily. And then the English version started to come out in a big way.
Yes, and now when I get my little Bible app out, I have a choice of about 200 different versions of the Bible for me to read. Which one do I pick,
Which
Dad?
one do you pick?
Give me at least two.
If you're doing kids children's ministry, there's only two versions I would use. One is the International Children's Bible. The other is the New International Reader's Version.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're into NIV, the New International Reader's Version is a grade 3 readability version of the NIV.
Mm-hmm.
I think the ICB is a better option. I think on balance it gets it right more often than when there's a question. The ICB also has some brilliant illustrations that I think are a lot more helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But the ICB we used to use when you were little, because we had so many kids in the service, we couldn't run a Sunday school during church. We used the International Children's Bible as the pulpit version. So when we did our Bible reading, we would read from the children's version. I would preach from the children's version, and we would do whatever else we did, the songs, everything else around that. And that worked really well, I thought, the feedback I got. So at our church, MBM at Rudy Hill, they're using the ICB for their children's ministry. The next step after that, for our Year 7s, we did a major search of English versions. We came back with the Christian Study Bible, which is put out by the Southern Baptists in the States.
Mm-hmm.
That's a readable and accurate, make some wise choices about how they represent things in the text. But I would hope that a kid in year 10, 11, 12 is moving into something that is more precise. And we'd be looking at something like either the New American Standard. There's the ESV is pretty precise. Or now there's a thing called the Legacy Standard Bible, which is the New American Standard Bible updated by John MacArthur's mob. And that seems to be a pretty good version. Mm-hmm. But we've got so many good choices.
Yeah.
It's worth going out and having a look and a play. And if you don't read Greek and Hebrew, which you probably don't, go and take it to your minister and say, would you check these out for me? You can find reviews online that will help you do that. But there's a thing called a readability test.
Yep.
And that readability test will tell you whether a kid at this grade can read that comfortably for themselves.
Yep.
And if you want to play around on Microsoft Word, when you do your grammar check, you can find a readability test. You've just got to put in about 300 or 500 words of the text.
Yep. To find out. Well, now that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you've enjoyed what we've been chatting about today. If you would like to but if you want to come and ask a question, you can head over to trainingforliferedeemed.com/120. We hope you hit the subscribe button. Come back and join us again next week. And yeah, not long now, it'll be school holidays where we are. So
yep,
looking forward to those.